Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 23 of Series 7. The question for the day is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Stoic ethics? Reading, for those who want it, from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 6. So I'll start off by saying that consciousness determines both the parameters and possibilities of human experience. Yet consciousness is also a source of problems as well as solutions. In these discussions, I'm working out solutions to problems in terms of value. That is, in terms of value states like meaning, purpose, self-esteem, and dignity. Now, ethical systems and principles are values that guide moral action, however we might define it. So ethics is one of the main ways that values are expressed, along with aesthetics, religion, meaning, and other expressions. This makes an examination of ethics essential to a wider study of value, and different theories of ethics revere different values and systems of value. These differences create another issue of contradiction and disagreement between different theories of ethics. So we're looking for favourable theories of ethics as well as enlightenment from their values. In Kantian ethics, we value cognition as reason and as universalization, and volition as intention, goodwill, and duty. But in Kantian ethics, we have problems of how reason can justify and produce objective moral action. In utilitarianism, we value practicality and the affect states of pleasure and happiness. Here we can question happiness as an adequate moral principle and motivation for happiness of others. And in Aristotelean virtue ethics, we value virtuous dispositions and excellence of character. But virtue ethics is naturalistic, relies on conventions, and cannot offer a clear principle of motivation. All these claims must, of course, be argued in depth as I do elsewhere. Yet Aristotle's virtue ethics is of particular interest here because it shares certain features with Stoic ethics. These are due to the historical, geographical, and philosophical circumstances of virtue and Stoic ethics. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, was born only 50 years after Aristotle. As a prelude to this comparison, and indeed critique, I should note my affinity to Aristotle's virtue ethics. In fact, I developed my own value theory ethics from an interpretation of virtue theory ethics, and I share the question of how to live rather than ethical action with both Aristotle and Stoic ethics. But Aristotle neglects two concepts central to my thinking: consciousness and value, and this neglect is reflected in Stoic ethics. I have frequently discussed the neglect of consciousness in ancient and indeed modern times. In ancient times and in religion, mind or consciousness was understood as a soul or spirit. Even more basically, body language was used in Hebrew and Greek to represent the soul or spirit. Hebrew used the terms nefesh or ruach, meaning the breath of life. The ancient Greek words pneuma and psyche similarly translate as breath of life, and pneuma as the breath of life was something physical. Ancient Greek philosophy might be assumed to have rectified this neglect, but this isn't entirely the case. Socrates did ask, "What is mind?" Yet Plato believed in an eternal soul coming from a realm of pure forms. And reviewing a number of articles on Aristotle's philosophy of mind, the researcher W.F.R. Hardy found that, I quote, Aristotle had no concept of consciousness, or not one corresponding closely to ours. And more alarmingly, Aristotle believed that the brain was an organ for cooling the blood. This poses a problem of ancient systems of thought being subject to modern critiques. With respect to value, Karl Marx may have overstated the point in saying that Aristotle had no concept of value. Yet Aristotelian virtue is, nevertheless, a matter of character, disposition, and inclination. And these virtues omit the Kantian moral features of goodwill and intention. In addition to these omissions, we can also say that Aristotelian ethics didn't give prominence to the value of people as ends in themselves. It also accepted naturalistic ideals without demur and was blind to the fact-value problem. And Aristotle fallaciously attributed the property of value, of purpose, to physical objects. In a similar criticism of Aristotle, Elizabeth Anscombe tells us in her work Modern Moral Philosophy that the term moral itself just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, unquote, because, Anscombe tells us, it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. Alistair MacIntyre elaborates on these points and informs us that in Latin, as in ancient Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral. Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek word ethikos, meaning pertaining to character, unquote. With respect to Stoic virtue ethics, we can note at least three differences to Aristotle's virtue ethics. These are to do with the relation of human beings in nature and the relation between virtue and happiness. Firstly, for Aristotle, happiness required some good fortune as well as living a virtuous life. But Stoics believed that only virtue contributes to happiness. Everything else is either wrong, not fitting, or only worthy of indifference. But this idea that a virtuous person will find a way to be happy seems to me to be unrealistic. Secondly, Stoics differed from Aristotle in their account of nature. Aristotle taught that we should live in a distinctively human way in accordance with the virtues, but the Stoics held that we should live by our knowledge of nature. But this involved problems that we will look at again later, such as problems of knowledge, Hume's principle, and More's naturalistic fallacy. Thirdly, the Stoics had a different account of virtue to Aristotle. For Aristotle, virtue is a question of character, or a disposition to feel and act in a certain way. For the Stoics, all of the virtues involve knowledge of some kind. For example, practical wisdom is a matter of knowing what to do. Temperance is knowledge and practice, moderation or excess. Justice is knowledge of the equitable distribution of goods to persons, and courage is knowledge of what is horrific and what is acceptable. Moreover, for Aristotle, the crowning virtue is magnanimity, but in Stoic ethics, the crowning virtue is wisdom. These interpretations emphasize knowledge more than Aristotle does, as well as in a similar way to Western philosophy. I previously noted this in the bias given to cognition in, for example, the cognitive non-cognitive distinction, and it can also be seen in the fact-value divide as well as in many other ways. Following these traits, I can characterize Stoic ethics with the three features of rationality, practicality and physicality. That is, common characteristics of Aristotelean and Greek thought help us to understand Stoic thinking. We can talk first about rationality. Aristotle's four basic principles of logic and their detailed expression have stood as monuments for 2,500 years. His views criticizing the idea of bivalence, that there are only two truth values, true and false, are quite refined. He believed that bivalence doesn't apply to contingent future events, and this seems to anticipate modern modal logic that includes possibility. Stoic logic was also quite broad. Anthony Grayling tells us that it included not just reasoning and its science, but also epistemology and philosophical grammar. But it is committed to strict bivalence, the principle that there are two and only two truth values. This might be seen as either an advance or a regression from Aristotelian logic or reason. Yet strict rationality certainly played a large part in Stoic ethics. One fly in this rationalist ointment came in the form of the zero, with metaphysical implications for the ancients. Ancient Greek thought largely believed that there was no void, and to accept zero questions the order of things. Pythagoras believed that reality is mathematical and that there's no distinction between shape and number. And consistent with Plato's theory of forms, a number couldn't exist without a shape or form. For example, the number 4 forms a square and 3 forms a triangle, but 0 doesn't have a natural shape, so believing in 0 would upturn Greek mathematics, logic and metaphysics. Secondly, Stoic attitudes to physicality reflect both a neglect of consciousness and aversion to the idea of voids or zero. The Stoics held that the universe is a plenum of matter, that is, without empty space between the objects. This is possible because physical pneuma permeates everything, including empty space. Democritus preceded Stoicism by 100 years, yet this view led to his determinism, including the human will. Stoics seem to be able to accommodate free will into physical determinism by means of compatibilism. Epicurus was not a Stoic, but a contemporary who gave one explanation of such compatibilism. Epicurus observed that existence of physical bodies must incur voids between them to allow for motion, and everything is in a process of change. But things can't come from nothing or disappear entirely. So therefore there must be tiny indivisible bodies that don't change. And these are called atoms, which means the smallest part of something. And these atoms have a small degree of indeterminacy. This enabled Epicurus to introduce the idea of the swerve. Some people think that the swerve anticipates the indeterminacy of quantum theory, but it gave Epicurus the space he needed to justify his compatibilist belief in free will. Like Aristotle, the Stoics sought happiness or eudaimonia, as well as a good or flourishing life. And similarly, the goal consisted in living in accordance with nature, and living well consisted in rational choices for those things which promoted that goal. These things were thought to have value, and we are supposed to be indifferent to other irrelevant things. Key to this Stoic attitude, we should seek to master whatever lies within our control, such as fear and passion, but face things that are outside our control with courage or even indifference. And this takes both knowledge and choice, that is, knowledge of ourselves or what is outside our control, and the courage to choose. Cicero commented on this Stoic attitude with the words, "To learn to philosophize is to learn how to die." This is because death is surely the greatest human vicissitude that is out of our control. The Stoic Lucretius explains this practical, rationalist and seemingly fatalistic attitude in the following way. Summing it up, he says correctly that death is nothing and that it is literally nothing to be afraid of. We aren't disturbed by the vast expanses of time in which we are absent before birth, so why should we be disturbed by our absence after death? But this response is inadequate, unrealistic, and what might be expected of a rationalist perspective. It seems only to resolve the religious fear of hell. Moreover, my future is different from my past, which offers me no possibilities. We have hopes for the future, and we invest in projects that we want to complete, and we grieve over those we lose, and they will grieve for us. Death also has a wider philosophical significance. It is representative of the wider problem of human finitude and loss, and we can ask why human existence must be afflicted with finitude, loss and death. The Stoic attitude to death is an aspect of the wider problem of Stoic indifference. Indifference is a way of resolving intolerable hardship or emotional conflict, but at what cost? Indifference seems to be inimical to many things that make life meaningful, enjoyable and even happy. That is, things like love, friendship and achievement, and seems to contradict the Stoic goal of happiness. And Nietzsche's philosophy of engagement and affirmation of every aspect of the world opposes indifference. Moreover, indifference also seems to contradict a satisfactory form of moral motivation. A similar criticism is sometimes made of Kant's strict notion of moral duty. For example, to give duty as a motivation for visiting a friend would disappoint him. This example is often given as a criticism of Kantian ethics in favour of virtue theory, but the Stoic virtue of indifference also seems to be lacking here. Yet Stoics might argue, as earlier, that their indifference is selective, that we must know and choose what is intrinsically good, like courage, prudence and moderation. But there are problems of knowledge here, as well as questions about what is intrinsically good. Kant, for example, said, "Nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good, except the good will," unquote. But even if Stoic indifference can be selective, which is in question, there is another problem, that selective indifference justifies indifference, which is then in danger of permeating everything. This is so because indifference isn't just neutrality, but it is a negative, a negation of the undesirable. Yet despite these problems, indifference as psychological or moral fortitude can be readily accepted as a virtue. Indifference can also be seen as being without affectations or not projecting neurotic impulses on the world. I have myself described positive absences of value as value refrain from such as resentment. Nietzsche also describes such absence as of a free spirit with the innocence of a child. But what we are talking about now isn't Stoic indifference, it is a further development that Stoic indifference has not yet achieved. It is being unaffected or self-contained without indifference or affectation. I have proposed that the nature of that self-containment can be described as values sufficiency. Yet we must of course recognise that an ethics reflects the values of a particular ethos. Stoic ethics was predominant in the early Roman Empire and reflected its values, like indifference to danger. And Stoic ethics was similarly applauded for its straightforward practicality. And like the relation of utilitarianism to Kantian ethics in later times, Stoic ethics released people from the complications of Plato's and Aristotle's metaphysics. Moreover, we find similarities between Stoic love of knowledge and reason and Kantian knowledge and reason. And we can likewise find similarities between Stoic and utilitarian practicality and happiness. We must ask whether these earlier Stoic forms are crude expressions of the later iterations, or can Stoic versions offer solutions for the later counterparts? Stoic ethics does, of course, combine them in one theory, but is that due to sophistication or to obfuscation? So what does Stoic ethics offer to modern theories of ethics? Like Stoic ethics, utilitarianism avoids problems of metaphysics, but with the idea of the maximization of happiness. Yet utilitarianism not only faces problems of quantification and motivation, but also that of justification. That is, the unresolved problems of an individual. How is an individual motivated to pursue the happiness of others, as well as the adequacy of happiness as an explanation and goal of human action? Virtue theory can appeal here to happiness as eudaimonia, as flourishing or the satisfactions of right action. But we still have the problem of an unclear principle of action only derived from character or disposition. On this issue, Aristotle was asked, if only the virtuous know how to act virtuously, how do we become virtuous? His answer was, practice the virtues in order to internalize them so that they become second nature. This answer may be adequate for applied or practical ethics, but it leaves a theory of ethics that we are supposed to believe in with crucial loose ends. Virtue theory is often thought to resolve some kind of outstanding problems of Kantian ethics. This view was memorably posed by Elizabeth Anscombe. She argued that Kant's reliance on duty, religion and law has weakened or disappeared, and that some resolution could be found in virtue theory ethics. Yet Kantian ethics is hugely ambitious with many problems. One of them is an over-reliance on duty, noted earlier, thought to be ameliorated with virtue theory. Another is moral distancing in mandating strictly objective behaviour in all circumstances. For example, expecting the value of the lives of strangers to be the same as friends or family. In these cases, virtue considerations of character and disposition is thought useful. But of course, virtue theory then has its own set of problems. But there are many other problems of Kant's ethics deriving from its reliance on cognition and reason that we can compare with Stoic ethics. Such are faced with Hume's law that a prescriptive moral ought can't be derived from a factual is. More recently, Philippa Foot has doubted that Kant's categorical imperative is indeed categorical. That is, Kant's moral imperative is only an imperative on some prior premise like a feeling. And it's not evident that virtue theory can address these kinds of problems. So we are returned to a comparison of Stoic virtue ethics with Aristotle's virtue ethics, and how Stoic virtue ethics might complement or only offer a degraded version of Aristotle's virtue ethics. Our initial assessment of Aristotle's ethics found that it neglected consciousness and, more significantly, value. But the physicalism of Stoic thought did nothing to alleviate that neglect of consciousness, and Stoic ethics similarly had nothing to offer to Aristotle's neglect of value. And it's significant that, for Aristotle, the crowning virtue is magnanimity, which is a value state, whereas in Stoic ethics the crowning virtue is wisdom, which is a cognitive state. Moreover, Stoic physicalism, lack of metaphysics and virtues and knowledge, exacerbates this neglect of value. And with respect to logic, Stoic thought entertained a less nuanced binary view. Stoics also believe that only virtue contributes to happiness, not circumstances. But this idea that a virtuous person will find a way to be happy is less realistic than Aristotle's view. The Stoic belief that we should live by our knowledge of nature rather than by other means is also problematic. It incurs problems of knowledge, Hume's principle, and More's naturalistic fallacy, as well as a trust in nature. So although virtue theory resolves certain problems, it raises others, like a neglect of value. And for these reasons, it can't provide clear principles of action that an ethical theory needs. These are some of the reasons why Stoic ethics fails to provide a rich account of human flourishing. Stoicism is supposed to be a practical method of attaining human happiness and flourishing, but those goals seem to be impoverished by questionable notions of practicality and rationality. My conclusion is that the advantages of Stoic ethics are its simplicity and practical appeal. These features, with that of indifference, may be suitable in times of crisis and lack of reflection, and these are advantages that should not be rejected outright. But they aren't adequate for the modern world, and even less so for an ethics of the future. As a positive response, I would draw a parallel between virtue theory and a value theory of ethics. This is because the virtues are typically value states, enabling virtue theory to be reinterpreted as value theory. And values provide guiding principles of action, as well as theories of justification and motivation. Yet this isn't a critique and reinterpretation of only virtue theory. It's an even more remarkable fact that we have no theory of value as a principle of ethics or meaning. Happiness has been formulated as a principle of ethics in utilitarianism. Reason and duty have been formulated as principles in Kantian ethics. Character has been formulated as a principle of ethics in Aristotelean virtue theory ethics. Yet value itself as a guiding principle of ethics is missing from moral philosophy. Yet the significance of value can be seen in the fundamental and indeed all activities of life. In religion, God is the believer's highest value, and various dogmas express particular values. A meaningful life is worthwhile and valuable and lit up by value. And ethical principles are values that guide our actions. In the next several workshops, I will be discussing utilitarian ethics, Kantian ethics, virtue theory ethics, and value theory ethics. After that, I will be discussing various features and criteria of my central principle of value. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com, philosophy of value workshops.